The UFC stays cooking. It stays on applying pressure on the news right now with the upcoming fights, matchups, cards, all over the place right now. We're just getting waves of news, and this is honestly amazing. A lot of the fights that the UFC is announcing right now, I'm loving the matchups. As you can see on the screen, and I want to start with this because this is, of course, the most upcoming thing, and that's the UFC 313, the pay-per-view next weekend. By now, everyone knows that Dan Hooker has pulled out of the fight. A crazy banger. Very disappointed, very devastated. But the UFC did what they needed to and brought in the replacement, Rafael Fiziev, to take on Justin Gaethje in a rematch. Now, they had a very close fight in the first fight. Rafael Fiziev is coming back from a really long layoff. Like, we haven't seen this guy in a while. And he had, I think, 2 losses prior, and he had an injury, an ACL injury, and he's coming in on 11, 12, however many days you want to say. He's coming on very short notice, take on a fight that sure is against an opponent he's fought before, but Justin Gaethje's coming in this fight with a full fight camp. They're keeping it as a 155 lightweight bout. And it's interesting because we're seeing reports today, Justin Gaethje himself actually said this, that the UFC approached Dustin Poirier, Max Holloway, Arman Tsarukyan, and I forgot the other name, about this fight and potentially replacing Dan Hooker. And he said that all of them said no, and the only person that was game was Rafael Fiziev. But Dustin Poirier comes out and he says he actually approached the UFC about fighting Justin Gaethje on short notice, which is crazy if that really is true, that Dustin Poirier was prepared to take this fight, given that he wants to plan his retirement fight. And then Arman Tsarukyan said that he wanted the fight at a catchweight bout of 160. Arman Tsarukyan trying to get back in the good graces of the UFC. If he takes this fight on short notice, saves the co-main event of a pay-per-view after pulling out on 1 day's notice at the UFC 311, that would have been sick, of course. Although, stylistically, I feel like Arman Tsarukyan's way more superior than Justin Gaethje. He's so much more well-rounded. But still would be a sick fight to help save this card. And, yeah, Max Holloway said no. And apparently the UFC didn't even consider Gamrot for this. But, Rafael Fiziev is taking on Justin Gaethje. Hopefully they put on an entertaining... It's actually 3 rounds, not 5 rounds. That's what we initially thought for the Dan Hooker-Justin Gaethje fight. It's not a 5-round co-main event. It's a 3-round co-main event. And, yeah, hopefully we get an entertaining, bloody, violent, just fight that we were promised by the Dan Hooker side of things with Justin Gaethje. But here we are with Rafael Fiziev taking... And I want Justin Gaethje... I think Justin Gaethje is going to win, coming with a full fight camp. I think he's going to knock him the fuck out. And yeah, that's what I'm going with. Justin Gaethje on Rafael Fiziev. And the rest of the card definitely took a hit. There's no doubt about that, but at least you keep intact Jalen Turner versus Ignacio Bahamondes. Don't care about the women's fight. You got King Green versus Mauricio Ruffi. Curtis Blades and Rizvan Kuniev is the featured prelim, and then Joshua Van. Not sure why it is looking like that, but there we are. UFC 313, Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev. So much of the Hooker news this week has taken away from remembering that we have an Alex Pereira main event title fight versus maybe his toughest challenge yet, but that's that. I will get into more detail on each and every one of these fights next week. But then next news, UFC 314. Oh boy. Wow, this is insane. This is incredible. They added Gene Silva to the card. They added freaking Gene Silva. Look at this, bro. Carlos Prates and Gene Silva. Back to back. 2 of the fighting nerds now on this card. Carlos Prates is my favorite fighting nerd, one of the most savage fighters in the UFC right now. And then you put in Gene Silva, who also is proving to be one of the most savage fighters in the UFC, coming off the most violent knockout of UFC Seattle. Incredible. We were all saying after that performance that this guy's going to be next up. He's going to be the next big featherweight star. And it might even be faster than we think. They're fast tracking him. He called out Bryce Mitchell right after the fight, right? And in Gene Silva's incredible personality, his theatrics that makes him special. He calls out Bryce Mitchell for Bryce Mitchell and the narrative surrounding him. He's saying some crazy things, Bryce Mitchell, right? About liking Hitler. Bro, Gene Silva is going to kill Bryce Mitchell. I am so happy this fight is happening so they could feed Bryce Mitchell to Gene Silva and Gene Silva could piece him up and knock him the fuck out, bro. Like, we need this, bro. I need Gene Silva to piece him up and knock him out violently like Josh Emmett did. And Gene Silva coming off the win off Milsic Bagdasarian. I thought that was going to be a lot more competitive a fight, but the way that Gene Silva handled that fight, you just feel like he has all the momentum right now to go out and after, what would it be, about a month and a half since UFC Seattle, to then go and take on Bryce Mitchell on this stacked, I mean, this is even more stacked now. UFC 314, this card is ultra stacked, bro. It's crazy. Danny Ige, Sean Woodson, Jeff Neal, Carlos Prates, Gene Silva, Bryce Mitchell, Michael Chandler, Paddy Pimblett. What's not listed on here, but Yair Rodriguez versus Patricio Pitbull, Pitbull's UFC debut, and then Lopez versus Volk for the undisputed featherweight belt. This card is so stacked. It's going to be insane to watch, and they just made it a lot better with Gene Silva coming off a crazy knockout to take on Bryce Mitchell with all the heat that's surrounding him for the crazy things that he's saying. Gene Silva, I need you to kill this guy. I need you to destroy him. That's what I need, bro. I need just an absolute bloodbath in this fight with Gene Silva taking on Bryce Mitchell. The last thing that I want to discuss from the wave of UFC news we received is Khalil Roundtree versus Jamal Hill. Jamal Hill, as we know, was a light heavyweight champion at one point. He beat Glover Teixeira. He won, but then he had to vacate the title due to injury. I mean, before the Yuri Prochazka fight, he fought for a title versus Alex Pereira. And this fight was originally supposed to happen at UFC 303, the card that was supposed to be headlined by Chandler and McGregor. And as we know, that fight fell off, and this fight fell off as well. Both these guys came off the card. So I'm happy they're finally rebooking this. Khalil Roundtree, of course, had a very proud and he had a great performance versus Alex Pereira. He stood there. He really gave Alex Pereira a good striking test on the feet, but ultimately Alex Pereira was just too much to handle for him. But he showed a lot of heart in that fight and a lot of respect from people. And yeah, this is a great main event for UFC Kansas City. UFC was not playing around when they said that they were going to go to more crowded fight nights in 2025. And I'm happy they're doing that, of course. That means they're going to make bigger and better cards when it's in front of a crowd instead of the Apex. They're even doing one in Iowa. And yeah, Jamal Hill on the 2-fight losing streak to Alex Pereira and Yuri Prochazka. But those guys are both a champion and a former champion. Jamal Hill himself is a former champion. So, and Khalil Roundtree, from what we saw from his last performance, this should be a great fight and also a big fight for both these men. And the rest of the card is pretty good for a fight night. Ikram Al-Askara versus Andre Muniz. That was rebooked after falling off Saudi Arabia due to visa problems. Gathje versus David Onama. I don't really give a shit about that fight. Michel Pereira versus Abus Magomedov. Pretty good middleweight fight between Michel Pereira and Abus Magomedov. Abus is coming off, I believe, a win. And Michel Pereira just lost to Fluffy Hernandez. And then as the co-main event, you got Anthony Smith versus Zhang Ming Yang. And this is Anthony Smith's retirement fight. Honestly, I don't know why he's coming back for this last fight. I thought 310 was his last fight. So to see him just come back for another check or whatever, I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not interested in watching Anthony Smith fight. I was ready for him to just retire and leave the UFC. But I guess they want to give him one more go. And he's just going to cough up his ranking spot to Zhang Ming Yang, who seems like a pretty dangerous light heavyweight out of China. So, pretty confusing way to match up Anthony Smith for his last retirement fight. But yeah, that's UFC Kansas City. Again, great fight news after, a wave of disappointment that we had from hearing about Hooker pulling out. And before that was that just crazy amount of news for 314, 315. But overall, everything's shaping up nicely. And yeah, UFC is in a good place right now.